Welcome. I'm Jean Selensky, librarian for the Memorial Libraries, which is consisting of two separate collections, one from Historic Deerfield and one from the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association. Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association. So they're the ones that own the Memorial Hall Museum where you'll be going next.
Okay.
So, and then HD, Historic Deerfield, runs about 12 historic houses along the main street.
Oh, okay.
So they're very, they both have very similar missions. PVMA started in 1870 though, so it's older. That's George Sheldon. He grew up on the street. He started collecting manuscripts and artifacts, and then the Memorial Hall opened in 1880, so 10 years after the association started. And so most of the items out here are from the PVMA library, the older manuscripts. They've got a wonderful manuscript collection.
How far back do they go, the manuscripts?
Well, you will see.
Oh,
So I've got some items out here. We have some early land deeds with Native Americans. So you see this is 1667, both of these. Unfortunately, I thought I had a transcription of that, and I don't. I just realized that 10 minutes ago. So yeah, I'm like, no, I thought I had one, and I just forgot to print it out. With these, you see the Native Americans, they're entering into these contracts thinking that they were just giving some rights to the land, fishing rights, that kind of things. And the English settlers took it to mean, no, this means this is our land now. So, you've got that going on. We have this early plot plan of the main street, and you see the lots were divided into these long rectangular lots, and then further out in the meadows, they also got pieces of land for agricultural purposes and woodlots too. So the woodlots were mostly up here on the other side of routes 5 and 10. So, and then this is, if you don't know
When you
what
say
this
the north, south, east, west, which direction are we going then for the woodlots?
East, right?
Yes, east, north,
So they're between here and the
south.
river, basically, the woodlots?
Yeah, the river really meanders around,
Oh,
so
so-
it's not an easy north-south.
But it's over there, though.
But yeah. And then west to Albany. So we have a road called Old Albany Road, that right on the left side of the common as you're facing it, and that goes out to the burying ground, which has all the old gravestones, but that was the path to Albany. So then we have, if you don't know of this book, it's wonderful, Captors and Captives, and there's a diagram of where the houses stood during the raid, and that was what they think was the stockade and the houses within it, so they show you that. John Sheldon, some of his family was taken captive, and he made several trips back to Quebec to try and redeem them. So he kept going back and forth, and there are some of these letters, thankfully transcriptions too, if you want to read those. He was trying to find where his family got divided up into, because some of them, they stayed different groups of Native Americans took them, and so they were in different places, Vermont, all around Canada. So, he was trying to find them. Yeah, so those are interesting. David Hoyt was also captured. He died of starvation along the way several months later, and some of his children were taken captive. Some were killed, some survived. So this is his inventory and then estate settlement, showing what his third wife at the time got and his 7 children. He still left, I think it still says, the children who got a piece too.
Excuse me, do you have a full transcript of the settlement?
Not that, no.
Not this. And
Yeah.
online you also have no transcribed information for those documents?
Not for these. These
Just
on
the
our
others, okay.
1704 website, that's where the transcriptions came from. But we haven't done everything yet. You know, if you'd like to do a transcript and transcription and send it to me, that would be very helpful. I started reading these, and it's been a couple years since I really had to look at 17th century handwriting. So you realize, I mean, it's a lot of fun, but it takes time to kind of
Some
really
words
get
are
into
really
that.
easy, and then other words are impossible.
Yeah,
Just
and you
noticing
try
on
and
these, you can
yeah.
see them, but then all of
Yeah.
a sudden you lose a word or two.
And you try to sound it out, because sometimes phonetically, once you hear it, you go, oh, that's what that word means, but it still can be confusing. Yeah, and then E's look like O's, or there's many ways to write an E, and yeah, I have to get into that again. And then we have, this isn't contemporaneous letter, but it was a later copy of a letter that Cotton Mather wrote to John Williams, the minister who was taken captive, and then wrote a very famous book. So this came into the collection in the 1970s, and the librarian then tried to authenticate it, and another repository, I think it was the MHS, said, you know, we've compared the handwriting and it's not the same, so it's not from 1705, and I don't know where the original letter is. But he wrote to John, they were cousins by marriage. John Williams' wife was the daughter of Increase Mather. I know, I'm trying to. And so Cotton was his cousin-in-law. And he wrote to him when he was captive and said, you know, keep up hope, we are praying for you. The eldest son of John was studying at the time. He was out in Harvard, and so he wasn't taken captive. So he also gives news of Eleazar, saying he's doing very well, and you don't have to worry about that one. So, then we have, so when the Reverend John was redeemed, he came to Boston in late 1706, and then back to Deerfield in 1707, and he wrote a book describing his captivity. This was such a blockbuster of the day. This, you know, went through so many editions. I think we have nearly every one, except the second edition, which was printed in 1720. So if you ever hear of one, please let me know. But they were reprinted into the late 1800s. This also showed up in probate inventories of Deerfield residents. So they all, most of them, had a copy, read it, you know. Then if you want to look through it further, you know, reprints over here. His son Stephen was 10 when he was taken, and he split up from his father, and so was the daughter Eunice, who was 6 when she was taken. His wife Eunice died along the way. It was just 6 weeks after giving birth, so the baby was killed during the raid. Eunice was still weakened. And along the way, just up in Greenfield, she was stumbling. She just couldn't keep up, so she was killed. Trying to think of so Eleazar was away. A few of their other children, Esther and Samuel, were also taken. So, but Stephen was redeemed also, and he wrote a little booklet, What Befell Him in His Captivity. So, and here's a reprint too, so if you want to look through that. We have many, of course, sermons that were given about the raid. We've got, just the Sunday afterwards, Timothy Edwards down in East Windsor, East Windsor, Connecticut, gave a sermon, and these are his notes, thankfully with a transcription. He was the father of Jonathan Edwards, so, you know, the infamous Fire and Brimstone Great Awakening minister. In 1741, another sermon was given. Mr. Williams, it was a Solomon Williams, and he was related to the Williams, but not, you know, he wasn't quite directly. But they were still talking about it. You know, this is 1741, this is still early. There were sermons given in Greenfield and Deerfield in 1837 still about the raid. That's when, probably going to jump ahead a little bit. Eunice stayed up in Canada. She was adopted by a Native American couple and treated very well. She forgot English. She converted to Catholicism and picked up French and Abenaki. So she married a Mohawk. This is where I start getting a little confused with all the tribes.
I know it.
And all the shifting alliances, but Arison. And she was quite happy. The family kept reaching out, kept trying to redeem her. It was her brother Stephen's biggest regret that his sister did not come back. But later on in life, she did visit, and they were infamous visits.
Why?
She came a couple of times.
She was Catholic.
Yeah, she was Catholic. She needed a translator to talk to her brother, and she did not, by then, she was so used to sleeping outside, she did not sleep in his house, so he just did not understand that. And her descendants, in 1837, sorry to pick up that story, her descendants kept coming back to make pilgrimages back here. They still consider this, their ancestral homeland. So there are gifts of items in Memorial Hall Museum from the descendants, which is, a nice story. But you'll see that once you get into the room and see the door from the house. It's really, it's just chilling. It's chilling, I guess, in a good way too. That we still have the door, and it still can be reinterpreted and tell so many new stories. So, I mean, that's what you're here for, right?
Right,
Yeah.
reinterpreting.
So what else can I say? So the story kept persisting, and this is 1837, another book was printed in Greenfield. This is already several editions in. A recap of the story, and it's really a morality tale for young children, to be thankful for what they have. Their ancestors had to endure so much for them, so listen to your parents. And then The Boy Captive of Old Deerfield. This was first written in the early 1900s by Mary P. Wells Smith, who lived up in Greenfield. She had a whole series. So this is Stephen's story, but she also had The Boy Captive of Hatfield, Hadley, Canada. She just pumped these out. This is early 20th century. People were looking back to colonial days to get these stories, so very interesting. And then in 1919, this is one of my favorite items, and kind of a swerve from the manuscripts, but a set of paper dolls were created about the captives. So there's six characters: Stephen, the boy captive, his sister Eunice, and a few other people who were taken.
Ooh.
And then Arison the Mohawk, who Eunice married, but they each got their own little booklet with a story.
Oh.
So it's really interesting how the raid was then monetized and, commercialized and made digestible for children. Here's now this little nice adventure tale where they go off and learn skills from the Native Americans. But you see that the clothing is pretty anachronistic. It's really more what people in 1919 thought, but you see that they could set up with this, with the outside, the house
goodness.
in Deerfield, and then,
And where they
the teepee.
Right.
So they could play with that, so.
And they wouldn't have actually been in teepees probably. So.
Yeah. So it's really quite fascinating.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So please have a closer look at the items.
Oh,
They were portrayed as savages up to very, I would say, recent times. There are monuments along the street that were put up late 1800s and in front of certain people's houses, the Williams House, Sheldon, Nims, and you say, you know, so-and-so was taken by the savages, you know, brutal attack and all of that. So you really didn't get the full story until, I'm trying to think, I think 20 years ago is when that book was published. So that's why I say like recent decades, where there's been more scholarship done about the raid, and putting it into a much larger context of the European wars and how they spilled over here, and the fight for land and rights and all of that. So very confusing. I mean, it's hard because, you know, there's not a lot of documentation, especially on the Native American side. You know, they weren't leaving a lot of documents, so it's hard to piece together from their side, you know, why they got involved and why they did it. And
There's
you know,
getting to be
it's more oral history handed down through
But
generations.
there's more documentation apparently than people thought there was.
Right, yeah.
Because some of the
Yeah.
natives that were involved in this, especially in the negotiations, were very literate, could speak English, and actually wrote things down too.
Yeah, so it's just, it was a matter of just digging and finding them,
Yeah.
and finding the sources in Canada, and many of them being in French. So
Yeah.
if you don't have that facility to read all of those languages, then of course you're going to get a very one-sided story. So it's good that scholars have been interested and pushed out the story
Right.
since, you know, in recent times.
So do any of you have a connection to Deerfield? Okay. And your interest here to come here is?
I think the partnership is interested in trying to understand the historical basis of 17th century Massachusetts. That's why we're here. This is our continuing try to understand, roughly speaking, 1620 to about 1700.
And did you have,
1710.
then you had ancestors, what did your ancestors go over?
There are no particular ancestors, it's just a general interest in
Interest,
Boston and environments, and our relationship with England too. And it's a partnership with the Historic Bostons is the name of the organization, and we have a continuing partnership.
Oh, and you're from them?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm the,
He's
You
the
look,
president.
you look familiar. I've seen you then on the videos.
I try to hide as much as I
No,
can, but no.
I've seen you on the Zoom.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
and your
sure.
name is?
John Morrison.
Yes,
Yes,
great.
yes.
Wow, I'm honored. I have to take a picture.
Fine.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
No, but so this is what we try to do, is understand what history and historic life and milieu and environment and economics and people and all that stuff were like at the founding of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and how they evolved from how the Bay Colony evolved in its first 60 years, really, up until our charter was revoked in 1676.
Right.
So
Right.
that's really, or 1678 or whatever it was, but that's sort of the end of Massachusetts Bay as an independent colony, and how independent we were. It looks like we almost declared an independence in 1645.
Correct.
When Charles was hiding, and so that's where we are, is trying to understand this period and how it relates to the current period, and so this is, the whole issue of our relationship with Native Americans and our relationship with land and their relationship with land. It's all pregnant with what we're trying to do.
And you are the significant other to?
No,
Good.
I'm just involved in this.
Okay.
No, it's just because I'm involved because I'm interested in how it's real. I'm interested in the historicity of it, that how people interpret what's going on. And that's one of the things that's why I started going to partnership events, because that was a thing. It's very,
I live in Michigan, so when they went virtual, I
Oh,
don't know what
yeah.
happened.
Yes.
yeah. So I've been going. I've been reading a lot.
Yeah.
I really like the fact that 2 weeks ago we were in Rhode Island at the Narragansett Museum, Tomahawk, and going to talk to, and in between we've been listening to people who are from the various nations that are around
Correct.
Massachusetts, and so it's been, I'm feeling like I'm learning a lot, and I'm talking to people who are interested in local history and finding out that they're having a hard time. All the local history people traditionally learned is only at most half the story.
Correct.
And the other half is different, and trying to hold both ideas in people's head at one time seems to be very difficult. And I've been really interested in interpretations. I started out it's really funny because the way I got involved in colonial history was studying space colonization into the future. And I'm an astronomer, and
You just are awesome.
so and I got interested, and I started looking at how much people were ignoring about how people live together in small places in what I would call alien territories. I started looking back, and especially early Massachusetts is a really interesting place to see how people come from what they thought of as being a civilized world, which wasn't necessarily as civilized as the Native Americans in lots of ways, to the Native Americans who had a totally different outlook on everything almost, and how they misinterpreted each other. Well, the Native Americans, they both misinterpreted. The Native Americans thought that the English were thinking more like them, and the English thought that the Native Americans were so different that you didn't have to worry about what they thought a lot of the time. And I mean, these are things that we live with still, these interpretations. And I think figuring out what they are, where they came from.
It's a benchmark.
Yeah, it's a benchmark. It's like where
and it should be changed.
And we need to change it, and we need to look at it really carefully. And I think it's just going to take a lot of time to do that. And I figure we're like 5 to 10 years into this process now. It's not something that happened in the last century even.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was easy to make assumptions before, and now it's more difficult to try and figure out to parse it and try to understand all of the flavors in this soup.
Yeah, my favorite thing we've done this fall was looking at the ransom narrative, Mary Robinson, versus look at it from the other side and read what she thought was happening. Her observations aren't necessarily wrong, but her interpretations are totally based on her own beliefs.
Yeah, and when she
We still act that way.
When she was given a spoonful of corn, she thought that she was being essentially starved to death. But it turns out, from other reading, that's a fairly typical meal for natives on the move. And she was given a portion just the same as everybody else was. And she couldn't understand that.
But yeah, it's almost 11:30, so if you want to, looks like the other group is almost ready to come in, so if you want to take one more quick look and then head over to the museum.
Come on through. Yeah, I'm Ray. I'm the curator here at Memorial Hall Museum. I've been here for 4 years, which is nothing compared to Tim's 47 years, but I'm catching up. So yeah, I don't want to kind of repeat anything that Jeannie said in the library, so if I am, just let me know, and I won't. But so it's interesting and kind of a little confusing, just because we're two separate organizations, where there's Historic Deerfield, which owns a lot of the houses on Main Street in Deerfield, and then we're Memorial Hall Museum, which I like to describe us as their older but smaller next door neighbor. So we've been here since 1870, and interpreting the art, history, and culture of the region for 152 years now. And so this, the organization really comes, the origins of it were in the 1704 story. So if, I guess I'll kind of launch into the story a little bit, and I know we want to talk a little bit about not only the story itself, but how we've interpreted it, and how we're telling that story to visitors. One of the things that I found when I first started here, we did some surveys of visitors, and we found out the majority of our visitors, A, they've never been here before, and B, they don't know what to expect when they come in. So while we have lots of knowledge on this story and this history, most of the people coming in don't. In fact, the majority of them actually aren't even local. So they're coming in totally unaware of the history that's happened here. And so they'll often come up those stairs right behind us here, and perfect timing.
Ta-da!
They'll come up, and so just this past spring, we did some upgrade to the interpretation of this room, and one of the first things we did was we put this illustration of the 1704 attack, so that when you enter the room, it's basically the first thing you see. As prior to that, there was a lot of interpretation around the multicultural aspects of the 1704 attack, which we thought was extremely important, and we do want to continue telling that story. But the gallery had last been redone in 2004 for the 300th anniversary of the attack. And there was, a lot of events around the 300th anniversary with all these cultures coming together, this time in peace. And that's fantastic for an event, but it doesn't work for an exhibit, because that's not what happened. That's 300 years later what was happening then and is still happening now. So we really looked at this and said, we need to tell the story of an attack, not the story of 300 years after the attack when we're just looking back at it. So fortunately, we did have this illustration had been done, it is in our collection for one of our historic websites. So we had this already, and we were able to enlarge it, and it really shows, I guess it gives people a glimpse of what the attack probably looked like. I mean, obviously we don't have any real on the ground renditions of it, but this, from our research and our understanding, is quite realistic. So basically what happened, and I apologize if you're familiar with the history already, but basically what happened is, February 29th, 1704, the dead of winter, the middle of the night, a raiding party came, and they climbed the stockade, which was easy to do when the snow was piled up to here. They climbed over the stockade and laid waste to the town. There were about between 300 and 400 people living in the town at the time, and roughly a third of them were killed, a third of them survived, escaped, and a third of them were taken captive back up to Canada. So that's what happened. But there's so much more to break down in that story. Who were the attackers? What were their interests? Who were the settlers? What were their interests? And so often it's easy to see this story as a very simple, indigenous land rights fight. And there was some of that in there, but that's not the heart of what the attack was. So what we did here with our image is we found, there are basically six different groups, ethnicities, involved in the attack. 2 of them on one side, 4 of them on the other side. And it was fortunate the way this illustration was done, we have examples of all 6 of them in there. So our goal was to highlight an individual and tell, in a very, one sentence, tell their story, and then the larger story of that group. So we had the English Protestants, which we tell, right here through Mrs. Williams, who lived in, obviously, the Williams house. We tell the story of Parthena, one of the enslaved Africans, she was actually killed in the attack. They believe, the contemporary accounts say she was trying to save 2 of the Williams children at the time she was killed. Then on the other side, on the attacker's side, the attack was actually led by the French. So we have a name that I feel best not to pronounce, but we have the leader of the French attack here. Yes, I as a non-French speaker, I would only butcher it. So it was a French-led attack, and they had 3 indigenous allies. So they had the Wabanaki, who were basically coming down for revenge. Not specifically revenge against Deerfield, just revenge against the English.
Right.
Not long before this, there had been an English attack on Wabanaki encampment in New Hampshire. So they were seeking revenge. You had the Kanyen'kehá:ka, or you probably know them as the Mohawks. They were close allies of the French in Canada, and they were coming to get captives. They wanted captives, actually for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into in a minute. And then there were the Wendots, also known as the Hurons. They were the smallest group involved, and essentially they were just there to support the French. They were close allies and had no problem joining in the attack. So the attackers came down basically from Montreal, in the dead of winter. came over the stockade and laid waste to the town. What I think gets lost in this, I said, it was not necessarily a land rights fight, which is, I think, how a lot of people, especially people walking in the door for the first time, think of it. It was much more, it was essentially a Protestant Catholic fight. They came here, they imported their war with them. They brought the war over on their ships, and they were fighting for dominance of basically North America. The English had what's today New England, obviously, and the French had what today is called Canada, and at that time was called New France. And where that boundary line was going to be drawn was very much up for debate. And at that time, Deerfield, was the farthest north and west English settlement in, quote unquote, the New World, which meant this was the frontier. And these people, they had a stockade. They knew an attack was coming. They didn't know when, of course, but they knew that this was not a safe place to live. So basically that's the story of the attack itself. And the most famous thing to come out of the attack, the physical object, was the Sheldon House. So the Sheldon House, which we have a picture of, actually it's downstairs, we should have one in here. But so the Sheldon House famously survived the attack. So most of the houses were burned. Actually, a lot of the people who were killed were sheltering in the basement, and the houses burned and collapsed down on them. Certainly not the way I'm hoping to go. But the Sheldon House famously survived the attack. They had their hatchets, they were hacking at the door, but most of the family was able to escape out the back. The Sheldon House was actually the first historic preservation attempt in America. Unfortunately, it failed. They couldn't raise enough money to save the house, and in 1848 it was very dilapidated and they took it down. So we no longer have the house. However, we do have the famous door from the house. It still has the hatchet marks in it. So we got some National Endowment for Humanities funding to look at how we're telling the multicultural aspects of this story, which is how we made this upgrade, and I'll talk in a minute about the wall behind you. We did not make any changes to the way we're talking about the door itself. That's not because we don't want to, it was really just, we had only a certain amount of funding and only a certain amount of staff, so we really had to look at, what is feasible and what can be done with our funding. So this is, an 18-year-old version of how we interpret the door. Though it's interesting, so you can see in some of the pictures on both sides of this center column here, different ways the door has been displayed and exhibited over time. So there's been some theatrics to it with having the axes and the hatchets displayed nearby, obviously not the original ones, but similar ones, at least what they believe would have been used at the time. And right now we're looking at, if you look on kind of the ground level there, who would have been on the inside and the outside, so to speak. We have the English on the inside, and then the French and native cultures on the outside. So ultimately we would like to do some changes to how we interpret the door. I mean, just physically we have all these big pillars in front of it that kind of block the view of the door, which is not ideal as far as I'm concerned. I think it's interesting, we have a lot of quotes from people, both really throughout history, on how the door has been seen and interpreted, or perceived. I think it's interesting. Personally, I think it's too much. I don't think anyone's standing around reading every single one of these quotes. I think they could be displayed in a much more easily digestible way, while getting the same point across. So long term, that is our hope and our plan. But we also have, alongside the door, you can see that, I believe it's a soapstone sculpture right there. That's obviously a contemporary sculpture by a Kanyen'kehá:ka artist. He made this in 2004 to tell their version of the story. So their version is a little bit different than the version that we tell here. You'll notice, if you can see from this side, there's actually a large bell on the back of that sculpture. It was believed that there was a bell that was supposed to go to the Catholic Church in Kahnawake, which is right outside of Montreal, where the attackers came from. There was a bell that was supposed to go to their church. The bell never arrived at the church. There was, and that, as far as we know, is true. For reasons that I'm not entirely clear on, they believed that the people of Deerfield had taken the bell.
Oh,
So they came down here, so they tell the, you know, what they call the bell story,
Oh.
which is they were coming to get their bell back.
ooh.
They didn't end up with the bell, so where the bell ended up is unknown. But that's their interpretation of it. So what we're looking at here, obviously, you know, in the sculpture, we have the door, we have the bell. We'll actually kind of get into some of the other things as soon as we turn around here and look at the aftermath of the attack. But we really do want to make sure we're telling an inclusive story, which is why we have the sculpture right next to the door itself. Which actually, you know, ties right into, you know, after the attack.
I knew that.
So this is where we really want to look at the multicultural aspects. And the way we do that is actually quite, at least in my opinion, quite interesting. Because we're looking at it really through one family. And even beyond that, one individual who kind of encompasses the entire story of the aftermath of the attack. And so that, the most famous person today in like the retellings of the tale is Eunice Williams. So she was a 7-year-old girl at the time of the attack. She was among the, what's the exact number, 112 taken captive from Deerfield. So she was taken and marched back up to Canada. She was taken by a Kanyankahaka warrior. And what we don't, I mean, obviously we don't fully understand everything that happened, but it seemed that there was very different treatment for people on the march back up to Canada. For example, Frank, who was an enslaved African in the Williams house, was the only adult male who was killed on the march back up to Canada. We don't know the reason he was killed. Several people were killed if they couldn't keep up. However, you know, he was a young man, essentially physically in the prime of his life, so that doesn't seem like it would be the likely reason. So that's a mystery and probably will remain so. Eunice, however, was given preferential treatment and was actually carried on someone's shoulders up to Canada. So she was taken, actually remember I said that the Kanyankahaka took people for a variety of reasons. Some of them was ransom, they just wanted to ransom the captives and get the money. But some of them, they had what's called the mourning war culture, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. And that was to take captives to essentially replace people in their own families and communities who had died. So Eunice was taken to replace a young Kanyankahaka girl who had died of illness. And people like that were essentially fully welcomed into the community and fully embraced and essentially made into Kanyankahaka people. And so they were, I find that so interesting because we think of, you know, our heritage and our culture as being what we're born with. But to them, it was something that could be fluid. It was something that could change if you were adopted into another culture, you could become that culture. And Eunice very much did become that culture. So a lot of the captives returned. The vast majority of them, I think they said 88 survived the march up to Canada, and 62 of them ended up being what they at the time called redeemed. Brought back to, well, whether it's Deerfield or the region, basically brought back to the English. Most of that was done through negotiations. We actually have the snowshoes up there that we believe were used by one of the negotiators to go up to Canada and essentially negotiate to get these people back. The most high profile of all the captives at the time was Eunice's father, John Williams. He was the reverend of the town. He was likely captured because they'd get the highest price for him. So they brought him back, and he wrote The Redeemed Captive, a book you might have heard of, and it's essentially the first-hand account of, you know, the 1704 attack and the aftermath of that attack. And that really set the culture around how the attack was talked about for probably 250 years thereafter. And obviously, you know, he did not care much for the French, to put it mildly. So he a very, very one-sided perspective, which for a long time is really how the story was viewed. There were the bad guys and the good guys, and there was not a lot of nuance in between. But as we can see, you know, doing the research and understanding what actually happened, there was a lot of nuance in there. So most of the captives returned. A few of them remained. So Eunice is the most famous one who remained. and she remained by choice. Her father, once he returned, he actually went up, I believe, 3 times to try to negotiate her release, and she refused. By the 3rd time he went up there, she could actually no longer even speak English. She had become fully enmeshed into the native culture. They changed her name when she arrived. First they gave her a French name, Marguerite. Then once she married into the culture, they gave her the native name Kenyenstahawe. It rolls off the tongue. So she actually married a man named Orosin. He was not originally from Kanawake, but he was a Mohawk he was a trader who ended up residing up there. So they met, they fell for each other, and they married. At first, even the Catholic Church did not accept their marriage. They basically told the Eunice, if you won't go home, at least marry someone French. And she said no. So they got married first in the
Character.
yeah.
Eunice, what a character. Strong.
Yep.
Since
It shows how she was brought
Yes.
up. That,
Sorry.
you know, the
Yes,
French
no,
were
you're
worse.
100% right.
The French Catholics were worse than
So yeah, so they first got married in the native culture, and then a few years later, the church did eventually recognize their marriage. So they ended up returning home 4 times over the course of her life. And they visited her family. You know, most of her family was captured and then brought back here over the first few years of after the attack. And she frequently came back to see 2 of her brothers. She, I believe, wouldn't even see her father, but she saw 2 of her brothers. Her brother Stephen, he was 3 years older than her. He had come back and he became the reverend down in Longmeadow. And his entire life tried to convince her to return. He never accepted her choice, always thought, you know, she had done the wrong thing and had betrayed her culture, but that it wasn't too late for her to change and follow God's path and God's will and return to what he believed were the chosen people. Of course, he was one of those chosen people. She obviously never did. In fact, when she visited one of her brothers who had been taken along with her, he had become bilingual, so he translated since she could no longer speak English and communicate with him directly. Same with her husband, who never spoke English. She wouldn't even stay in his house. She would stay outside for fear that they wouldn't let her out. But she came back 4 times, and each time she brought a gift from her culture. And while Stephen never approved of her decision to stay, he at least had the foresight to keep the 4 gifts. And we have those 4 gifts right here that she and Rosen had given to Stephen. So this was really kind of the crux of what we were looking at when we started this whole project. You know, how are we looking at these gifts for decades, even longer? These have been known as Rosen's gifts. I wondered if they even were Rosen's gifts. Were they Eunice's gifts? Whose gifts were they? You know, the Mohawk is a matrilineal society, which is why there are a whole bunch of, even if you go up there today, Williams is a very common last name in that area because it's passed down through the mothers. So, you know, we did a fair amount of research. We reached out to, historians, cultural representatives, other institutions that have similar things in their collections. And, you know, it's tough. We did not find the answers to all of our questions. We did find some information about, who would have used these things, where they would have come from, trying to understand what the significance of the 4 gifts are. Just for reference, one is a tobacco pouch, one is a sash, one is a bullet pouch, and the other one is what's called a gorget, which was essentially a decorative jewelry element that would have been worn around the neck. So we are very fortunate to have these 4 items, because these, as I see it, we have really both ends of the story here. Because we have the door, where you can see 2 cultures coming together at war. Over 1 generation, these are the same people. You know, it's not like 300 years later where now we understand times are different. These are the same people who were on the side of one side of that door or the other giving these gifts. So I think that's really helps bring the story full circle. And then that really led us into the reflecting element. how do we tell this story? How do we look back at it? Because one of the things, while Eunice is, has been well known around Deerfield and beyond since 1704, we don't have any first-hand accounts of her. She left no writings, her husband left no writings. All we know is what's been passed down through oral and then later written tradition. And so we looked through the kind of our historic record to see what we could find of her. And it really, her story is often used as a vehicle for the views of that time period. So, in 1837, one of the local reverends used her story to illustrate that we are all, how did he put it, as we are all people of one blood, descended from Adam and Eve. But 60 years later, one of the historians who actually helped found Memorial Hall Museum wrote her book, True Stories of New England Captives. And she was adamant that Eunice was a prisoner her entire life, desired to return home, and was never gave up her culture. And then as Deerfield grew, her story was basically commercialized. There were, in the 19-teens, there were pageants that reenacted historic moments through the town. Looking back at them today, it's not what we would consider appropriate, to put it mildly. But her story was key among those. And about, really about 100 years ago, when Deerfield started to gain the kind of the image it has today, a lot of people tried to commercialize that and make money off of it, some quite successfully. And so we have things like there was a paper doll set of the children. Yep. And then we have cookie cutters. There's a Eunice and a Stephen cookie cutter, which we actually have up on the 3rd floor. And then, more recently, say 2004, we talk about how, that's when we had the 300th anniversary, one of the things that our organization commissioned was actually an operatic telling of her story. And that, through our operatic telling of it, we talk about how she was a woman of agency who made her own choices. And that's where we are today, and we can kind of extrapolate on where this history might lead us and how she might be viewed in the future. But as I said, it's always through someone else's lens and never through her own. So that kind of, and I should have said this earlier, jump in if you have questions.
That's wonderful.
So that's really how we're telling the 1704 story, but it's not how it's always been told. And for that, we look at the plaques on the wall to your right. When the museum and the organization was being founded in the 1880s, they had what was essentially a fundraiser, where the descendants of families involved in colonial era attacks, 1704, yes, but also some of the other ones that happened in the area, were invited to commission a plaque for their ancestors. So this is, these walls, or this wall at least, is all of those plaques. And you can see, actually, some of the people from 1704 are mentioned in here. We have the Williams plaque right here, with Mrs. Williams and Reverend John, and then Eunice is mentioned right here, and they actually mention Orosin as well. He's the only native person mentioned on the wall. Frank and Parthena are mentioned here as well, the only enslaved Africans mentioned on the wall. Most of them, I'd say 99% of them, are the English Anglo-Saxon settlers of the region, because that's who was telling the story back then. They were under the belief that the indigenous tribes from this area had vanished. So who left to tell the story but the descendants of the settlers? And so we get this, then the language can be problematic. What was appropriate in 1880 is certainly not appropriate today. So the previous curator before me actually went through and found a few that were obviously inappropriate. And what she did, I think, was brilliant, because this is a historic record. We don't want to mess with this. But at the same time, we don't want to let this be the public face of our organization. So she came up with these different curtains, basically.
Yeah.
So like say this one here, you can see what was appropriate at the
She
time.
married a savage.
She married a savage and became one. With what is the appropriate language today, she married a Kenyan Kahaka and adopted the culture, customs, and language of her new community in Kanawake. Same with Frank and Parthena. their story here originally describes them as Negro servants of John Williams. We would call them, well, enslaved Africans or African slaves, because that, I think, more accurately depicts that history. So not only did we do this, but we also went beyond this to look at, whose stories are being told and whose aren't. So obviously, this is essentially the white Anglo-Saxon history, but even that is not complete. Many, these were not free, that's why they're different sizes. Some people like Marshall Field of the Marshall Field department store. He's a descendant of the Field family of Deerfield. He had the money to get the biggest plaque and put his name in big letters on the bottom. Well, most of them are not signed. Marshall Field was a fan of Marshall Field. So some of them, obviously, some families did not put as much money into it, and some families did not have any money to put into it. So those stories are not being told. Or some people didn't have descendants, so those stories are not being told. And obviously, with the very few and very minor exceptions, we're not telling a native story here. We're not telling an African American story here. So that's something that we've tried to rectify with a couple of plaques of our own. So behind you on the wall to your right is our plaque for the Pocumtuck people, who were the native people of Deerfield. So we did this plaque, as obviously before I worked here, but it was in 1992. We worked with the Pocumtuck people to put up a plaque. And Tim tells the story very well because he was involved directly in it. But he said that the Pocumtuck people said, this is not our plaque, this is your plaque about us. If we were going to make a monument, we would do something outdoors. We would pile stones. That's how we would make a monument. We're happy that you have a monument for us, but this is to make you feel better, not to make us feel better. They said what they wanted to know, so we said, well, if we make a plaque for you, what do you want to be known? And they said 3 things. First, we were always here. No bearing land bridge. We were always here.
Oh,
Yep.
wow.
Second, we were driven out. We didn't leave by choice, we left by force. And 3, we still exist. Because that was, even the founder of of our organization talked about how they had vanished from the landscape. They hadn't vanished from the landscape. They had married into the cultures, not unlike humans did. They're still here, and they want that known. And then a few years later, we did a very different plaque for the black population of Deerfield. And they wanted something, obviously we worked very closely with them to talk about what accurately represents your history and your culture. So we worked very closely with them, and they wanted something, first they wanted something made out of wood. And they were very specific about not wanting any text on the plaque. They said that, look at that, the way text is interpreted over time changes. And it's, what's appropriate today might not be appropriate tomorrow, or vice versa. So they didn't want any text. They wanted a symbology that tells their history. So we worked with, we worked with a large group to put it together, but one person who designed it, and then another local carver who carved it. So we have, the African drum, the reference to the shells, the references to Africa. It's hard to see from far away, but there's the slave ship here, and then the breaking of the chain, telling their story of their presence on this landscape. So one of our goals, I guess even going forward, is to look at how we're telling a full, inclusive, and multicultural story. So that's essentially how we're doing it in relation to the 1704 story, which is great because that, as I said, was a very multicultural story that has gotten often lost in the simplification of the tale. But that's not the only place that we can tell a multicultural history. So, how are we doing on time here? That's my first question.
Please continue on.
12:06, that's great. So we got a little time in here, and then we can go elsewhere in the museum, talk a little bit about how we're taking this approach and applying it to other aspects of the museum. But this is actually, since we're over here, one key example of that is looking at how we're talking about the indigenous presence here. This is an indigenous sculptor put this together in 2004. We worked very closely with a lot of groups around the time we were going to tell the story of the 300th anniversary. And he made this sculpture, which talks about the, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, Which Way to Deerfield, a modern Mohawk headdress. So he was a Kanien'kehá:ka sculptor from Kahnawake up in Canada, and it really goes to show how the enduring legacy between the two places. So sure, you know, the captives were taken up there in 1704, but 300 years later, that legacy persists. And this sculpture refers specifically to what are known as the Iron Walkers. So this is not necessarily Deerfield specific, because as you may have noticed, we don't have a lot of skyscrapers around here. However, the Mohawk ironworkers were famous and are famous today for basically being fearless in the building of the framing of skyscrapers. Built basically, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but a lot of the famous Manhattan skyline, a lot up in Montreal near where they live. That connection has endured, going back and forth between the two, with Deerfield right in the middle of the two. So we want to make sure that we're including their story, you know, how that legacy has gone forward and how that connects back to 1704. You know, one of the things that the sculptor talked about here is that, you know, really in his artist statement around this, he talks about how a lot of people up in Kahnawake have blue eyes. And he refers to that as maybe a sign of some of the people we liberated from Deerfield. So, perception. I guess that will lead us very nicely into the room right behind us here.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
All right, so the first attack in Deerfield was 1776, 1676.
That was Hatfield. It was 16.
Hatfield, okay, yes.
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
but that was all part of the, that war that time.
Yes, yep.
And then you have someone who's, it looked like there's sort of a continuation of attacks on here over the next 20 years or so.
There were a fair number of attacks on Deerfield throughout the region. The last one was 1746, known as the Bars fight. We can actually talk a little bit about that in one of the other rooms. You have a couple of relics from the Bars fight, but that was the last indigenous attack on Deerfield. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, this was not a safe place.
Yeah.
This was
You were the frontier.
Exactly. And you know, you want to call for backup.
Yeah. And furthermore, you were on the frontier where the French thought we might be able to take some of this land and make it part of Quebec or a part of Canada or French.
Essentially, you're 100% right. Essentially, that's the reason Greenfield exists.
Yeah.
Was because the people of Deerfield, once they had land rights to the land that's today Greenfield, they wanted another town up there, so that town could get the attack first. So they tried to sell off all their land as soon as it was granted to them, and I mean, that's not a great sales pitch, but you take the attack, we'll be fine. But that's actually one of the reasons, if you notice, most of all the old towns in the Connecticut River Valley, Main Street runs north and south. Greenfield, it runs east and west, because that was supposed to block the attack coming down. Greenfield never was attacked. So lucky people who took a risk and bought that land. But yeah, this was a dangerous area.
Yeah. And this attack I think you portrayed it as essentially a planned attack on this particular location and
Yes.
no other.
Exactly. Yep.
Huh.
Yep. It was exactly that.
And it was part of the argument between England and France about who would control the western part of this country.
Yep.
West of the Connecticut River.
Right, which is the Wild West.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's something we put it up in the kind of the main text there. At the time of the attack, this was a tiny frontier settlement, and it became the center of the Western world. Everyone, you know, cared about what was happening in Deerfield for that brief moment. From the King of England, King of France, Spain, everyone, all eyes were on Deerfield. Mm-hmm. So this, while it can be, even at that time was not thought of as, some great metropolis, this is where it happened.
In the picture, those are quite substantial houses.
The houses were quite large back then. You wouldn't think it just because of, their technology and the tools they had. But I guess the flip side of that is they had huge families. Because you needed, 7, 8, 9
And
children
you're
to.
clearing lots of timber. for
Exactly,
farming,
yep.
too. So
Yep.
what do you do
Certainly
about
there's
the timber?
an abundance of timber, but it's gotta be cut,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
and then it's gotta be sawn.
Yep.
Did they have a mill already operating a mill? They must have.
I don't know what the mill situation was in
The mills are
1704.
usually built multiple years, a decade or two after settlement, is my experience in Massachusetts, in the east.
I mean, that sounds right.
But you certainly had falling water.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
down
yes.
From the hills.
Oh,
yeah.
yes. Oh, yeah, no lack of good woodlots around here.
Yeah. But this is a town of more than 300 people?
At that time, I think it was around 300, I don't know
Yeah.
the exact number.
That's about a third, a third, a third.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah, that's how it.
Yeah, sizable, that means by 1704, they would have a mill.
Yeah, I mean, the
somewhere
town
around
had been settled in, off the top of my head, 1677, thereabouts.
So right after, right after it no longer was a permanent battleground.
Right, yes, after the Hatfield attack.
Right, yeah, because,
You know, coincidentally, the guy who went up to Canada after the Hatfield attack to redeem those captives successfully was killed in the Deerfield attack.
okay.
So, didn't work out for him.
Wow.
Let's see, do we hear?
So
Keeping an ear out for the other group.
Okay, so the
Pre-colonial objects and artifacts to contemporary, artwork, beadwork, some really fantastic stuff. So this was done before I started here, but this was done in very close conversation with multiple representatives of multiple tribes, even down to choosing the wall color in here of what would have been appropriate and what would have best represented their collective history. Oh yeah, no, this is just beyond anything else.
Oh, we're blown away by the story, the way
Yeah.
you tell the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is beautiful. Sort of a memorial.
Mhm.